Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. In these episodes, we've been talking about the evolution here of recreation, of how people have enjoyed themselves, what they have done for fun and games. And we began in episode number 1 talking about recreation of the most primitive sort that we had back in the 19th century, or just after Pensacola and Florida became part of the United States, and how people enjoyed dancing and books and just a little bit of everything that was homemade almost to the nth degree. Then we passed, as we moved into the latter part of the 19th century, we had, of course, more favorable economic times. People had more money. People were developing new forms of recreation. Beginning in the 1880s, we had our first football games. We had our first baseball games, actual form baseball teams, some by local groups, some by businesses. And then, of course, in 1885, we had the coming of the Opera House, and all of the things that brought together in downtown area that brought a new sense of culture here. As we passed into the 20th century, we had the beginnings of the extension of such things as lodges and the things that brought men together, and a little bit later on, women in the same sense. These are the Elks and the Lions and people like that. And then, of course, we began to have other forms of sport as the YMCA itself developed here. And that's basically where we left our story last time. Well, in the early part of the 20th century, people began to enjoy music in a different sense. Because they had more money, many more families were now buying such things for the home as a piano or even an organ. And as a result of that, we had, first of all, Clutter's Music House downtown that sold and serviced such instruments. And then we had, of course, soon after that would come the Reynolds Music House, whose owners, of course, had come here from Mobile. And we have more of this sort of thing developing. And by the time we get into the early part of the century, we now have many more teachers, or not, I shouldn't say many more, we had more teachers who are of a high caliber teaching music and art. There were half a dozen men and women who taught not only piano lessons, but also gave basic instruction in other forms of instrumentation. And of course, as all of that happened, you had more people beginning to enjoy coming together for dances. Because early in the 20th century, we began to form more dance clubs, more dance groups. And the first one we particularly want to mention is the Clutter family. Clutter's Music House was a family. And they not only had the music house to sell and service instrumentations and sheet music and all, but they also had their own orchestra. And they had their business house was on South Palafox Street, and associated with it was Clutter's Music Hall. And many of the fine social events of this era were being held in Clutter's. Now, along with all of this, of course, you begin to see more interest in sports. Music was segued into sports, and we have the first records that we can find, and we have wonderful pictures of these in some of the annual books are put out by the high school that show us pictures of the high school football team and the baseball team, and a little bit later on basketball team that would come into action here because of the presence of the high school. And of course, with the YMCA segued along with the high school activities, we begin to see these same sports spread out in the community. Now, one of the more interesting things that happens just a couple of years later, as we get into the middle of the second decade of the century, we now have the formation of organizations like the Rotary Club and the Lions Club and the Kiwanis Club. And of course, these are mostly, at that point, they're mostly young men. And the YMCA takes advantage of this to promote fellowship and interplay. And so the YMCA begins to sponsor annual softball games between these various civic organizations. They're played in a park, and happily the newspaper covered these with some detail. So we know a good bit about how people came together and just had a good time doing this sort of thing. Well, by the time we get into the latter part of the 1910, the second decade of the 20th century, all of the things we've mentioned before are gradually building up. We have more people with money, and they're enjoying, first of all, the motion picture theaters. They're enjoying also the sports. And as we move into this third decade of the century, the 1920s, we come into what a lot of people call the Roaring Twenties, and this was the jazz era. And of course, Pensacola was not unlike many other cities these young men came together to put on stream their own form of music. They have this, and we have the same thing going, of course, in the 21st century in a different form. And as these young people came together, we had John Paul Jones and the Admirals. We had the Rainbow Boys. We had the Foot Stompers. They were all playing what people call jazz. And of course, by the time we get into the early 1920s, the San Carlos Hotel, which had opened here in part in 1910, now had built an addition. And they had a large ballroom as part associated with that. And the ballroom was one place where if you wanted to have a truly fashionable dance affair, that's where you had it. And then, of course, there were other facilities built right along the waterfront in what we now call East Pensacola Heights, and there were dance facilities there. So people were just enjoying this sort of thing far, far more than they had before. By the time we reach 1926, we have enough serious musicians here, so they begin to put together an organization to promote and enjoy classical music. And in 1926, we have the beginnings of our what is today our Pensacola Symphony Orchestra. Then there were just a handful of men, probably about men and women, about 2 dozen of them, who came together and created what they call the Pensacola Philharmonic Orchestra. Now, that orchestra, when it performed, had 2 locations that generally were used for their performances. One of which was the auditorium, which was completed in 1920 for the new Pensacola High School, a beautiful, very spacious auditorium, seated several hundred. That was one place. And then about the same time, the Pensacola Chamber of Commerce purchased a structure that was on the corner of what would be Jefferson and Garden Street. There was no Jefferson Street there then, but that facility also had a hall which was used by the Pensacola Symphony or Philharmonic, and again, people began to enjoy classical music in that way. Now, about the same time, of course, 1925-26, people began to be interested in another medium. And in 1926, Pensacola was one of the first cities in the country to have its own radio station. And this, of course, was WCOA. The call letters were WCOA. They stood for Wonderful City of Advantages. And their first station was on the 2nd floor of City Hall. The present-day Wentworth Museum was on the north side of the building, and it had 3 separate buildings, or for 3 separate rooms, properly insulated for sound purposes. And this was when they began to offer all sorts of wonderful entertainment. When the station first went on, they had about a 2-hour segment in the morning. It was directed pretty much to the farm and the farm family. Then there were 2 hours in midday that were pitched pretty much to the homemaker. And then, of course, they came on the air either 6 or 7 o'clock at night with a whole variety of things that were general entertainment. Of course, all locally done, locally produced. There was no such thing as transcription material or network broadcasting then, but it was a grand success. And WCOA would continue to be a facility owned and operated by the city up until 1931, when it changed hands and was purchased by the Pace family. Okay, also in the latter part of the 1920s, middle part of the 1920s, we have the arrival of the Sanger Theater. We have to mention that in particular. Now, in 1917, another hurricane had blown through here and done serious damage to the Opera House. And fortunately for the community, when they pulled down the building, when they took down all of it was salvageable, the contractor, Charlie Turner, had the foresight to save just about everything he could. That included the brick and all of the wonderful decoration that had gone all through that wonderful building. And Charlie put it in a warehouse. Well, in 1923-24, along comes Julian Sanger. And Mr. Sanger had already built what he called movie palaces in, first of all, New Orleans and in Mobile, and Pensacola was to be the next one. And he contracted with Mr. Turner to build the facility. The structural steel was trucked here by Chevrolet trucks from Birmingham, and Charlie Turner again was the builder. And when you visit there the next time, you can get an idea of how wonderful the community has protected some of its cultural assets. Look at the outside of the building, and you'll see that about 2/3 of the way up, at least on the back side, on the riser, you see that the color of the brick changes, and it becomes a much different brick. And that is because Charlie Turner ran out of the old Opera House brick at that level and had to purchase new and match as well as he could. Then when you're inside, stare around the building, and on the inside, just look at the beautiful decoration elevation over the stage on the right side and the left side. And much of what you will see there is material that Charlie Turner had saved from the Opera House and then installed in the Sanger itself. When the Sanger was redone in 1982 and then redone again early in the 21st century, all of that wonderful artwork there was carefully redone and preserved, and so we have the Sanger as part of our heritage. Okay, we move into the 1930s. And the city of Pensacola now has an opportunity to do something new. First of all, they have, well, I have to set back a little bit. We must go back just a couple of years before the 30s. Look at the story for the city of Pensacola late in the 1920s. In 1926, people began to come to the city and say, look, Pensacola ought to have its own municipal golf course. Well, about the same time, a group of young men, the Junior Chamber of Commerce, had already started one. It was out on the west side, and it was a small 9-hole affair, which was doing well, but they were having trouble making it work. And so the JCs came to the city council, and in 1926-27, they made a contract arrangement, and the city purchased Osceola Golf Course. It was 9 holes. It had a clubhouse, but very small. So immediately the city set to work, and of course this is the late 1920s. While economic conditions are good, the city immediately appropriated additional monies. They had paid $30,000 for the course, and they put forth other monies to expand the 9-hole course to 18 and also to enlarge the clubhouse. Well, about the same time, another group came to the city council and said, look, we need a place here where we can really play football, and maybe we can attract a professional baseball team. We need a facility for sports. And they went back and forth on this. And finally, in 1928, the city council agreed that this was necessary. And they acquired property out on West Gregory Street. And in 1928, late 1928, they opened what was then called American Legion Park. Over time, the word American sort of got left off of the title, and it became known as Legion Field. And Legion Field then became the home of all sorts of sports. It was the site where the high school football games were played. And of course, this was where a succession of professional teams, particularly many people, old timers, will still remember the Pensacola Flyers, who played there for a number of years. So that was where basically the headquarters for sports were, and that would the Legion Field would remain in use well past the middle of the 20th century, when its age and infirmities were obvious and it was torn down. And the city was without a facility for a number of years until an opportunity came to use property that the city had at the foot of 9th Avenue, right across from Aragon Court and what was then the sewage treatment plant. And in the early 1970s, they erected a new sports facility, which of course became known as Admiral Mason Park. And that park continued to serve professional teams and many other activities for a number of years. Well, as we move forward into the 30s, the city recognized that even with a depression on, they wanted to have more organized sports arrangements for people of all ages. And so in the mid-30s, they began to tinker with, to plan about for what became known as city recreation. And it was at this time that they made a rather unusual arrangement. By this time, the man who headed the YMCA was a very able man who loved sports and who loved people. His name was Julian Olson. And Julian Olson was asked if he could find time to offer a little guidance to the city and be the part-time director of city recreation. And Julian agreed, and this is what was the case here up through the war years. So all through World War II, Julian Olson carried on both of those activities. He was the director of the YMCA and also the part-time director of local sports for the city, and it worked. And so it was Julian Olson that we must credit with bringing on stream many of the wonderful activities, particularly those for youth. And of course we also have to recognize his foresight in seeing the need for additional facilities, and we'll try to talk about that in our next episode.